Hi all, I thought we would do a philosophical kind of video today talking about the top 10 most solid openings playing black versus 1e4. So a pretty concrete question but still kind of philosophical. So to answer this one must ask, well, what is solidity? If I'm going to present you 10 really solid opening choices, what is solidity? And I've been thinking about this morning. I think it has some kind of relationship with reversibility. So if you look at the strong moves video recently, where we asked that philosophical question, what is a strong move? And I argued there that a strong move does irreversible damage to the opponent's position, especially when there's an opportunity to do so. Doing such a strong move makes it very difficult for the opponent to come back at you. In terms of an opening, can we link that with solid openings? Do they have a relationship with a lack of reversibility, a kind of form of stability? So they're not so crushable and exploitable in terms of exploitable weaknesses. With exploitable weaknesses, if you play an opening not at all solid, you can imagine losing very quickly and losing very easily, or both quickly and easily as a result of those exploitable weaknesses. So we want the opposite of that kind of thing. And I've looked around the internet, for definitions of solid. There's some arguments, about what is solid. Solid, as in the physical world, is not liquid. Liquid, in terms of chess, you could argue, well, full of exploitable weaknesses. A solid object has less fluidity, less reversibility to other structures. The solid things might keep coming at you like a Terminator. Even if bits come off, they persist, they still come at you. They're not so easily defeatable. So Terminator, one of my favourite films, Arnold Schwarzenegger. So they're pretty solid, those Terminators, difficult to beat. So in chess, how do we have a Terminator start? And what are we talking about? The pawn structure being solid, the pieces being solid, both being solid, the relationship between them, the king safety being safe. Is it characterized by minimal risk-taking? Is it an emphasis on quiet positional play rather than wild tactics? Other interpretations I've seen, a side which has no obvious weak points, opposite of risky, a safe opening without too many chances to lose. Well, that links up with not wanting to play openings, which are kind of embarrassing. You lose very, very quickly and easily. That's one thing which I definitely don't like, even in blitz. So there's lots of interpretations. Quite often people consider the pawn structure being sound. The pieces are safe, the king's safe. So how to achieve this state of solidity conceptually? What trade-offs need to be made? What concessions need to be made? And I come at this with 10 different choices which represents kind of different trade-offs you might make. And some people equate dullness with solidity, that you don't care if the game's duller as long as you've got a solid position in some sort of aspect. And a classic example which comes to mind of this particular kind of trade-off is in the Ruy Lopez, the Berlin defense, or the dreaded Berlin Wall. Championed by Vladimir Kramnik, he used it to neutralize Garry Kasparov. The problem for us club players is that maybe the opponents with white are going to do something else before we even reach this. But the Berlin Wall, let's have a look. So e4, you play e5, knight f3, you play knight c6, and after bishop b5, you play knight f6. It has a reputation of being a solid opening, if ever there was one. So much so that grandmasters have changed their repertoire a bit, not playing e4, getting into Catalan territory instead because they can't stand this, players with black playing this particular way. So it definitely has a reputation of being a solid opening, a drawish opening as well. Very difficult to lose, you could say, with the black pieces. You make it more difficult to lose anyway. So why is this? What trade-offs are being made here? What concessions? Well, say white castles. You play knight takes e4. After d4, you hit that bishop. This is an example variation. White gives you that bishop. Okay, you've got double pawn. So this is also outside of the definition that some people seem to believe the pawn structure needs to be solid. This is more in line with a broader conceptual idea that you're actually making yourself difficult to beat quickly and easily. You've accepted double pawns as a downside, as a concession. You've accepted a compromised pawn structure here. So d takes e5, another concession. You don't mind it being a bit dull. The queen's coming off the board, but you've got the bishop pair here. Your king's also being inconvenienced. So in terms of king safety, you could argue, well, the king can't castle, surely it's not that safe. The thing is it actually that exploitable, the king safety? The notion of exploitable weaknesses, I think, is key to this discussion. You can have apparent weaknesses, but they might not be that exploitable, and therefore you might actually have, without knowing it, a state of solidity, because then if the weaknesses are not exploitable, they're not really weaknesses in a way. So we have this position after knight c3, king e8, which has become the dread of many swarms of grandmasters. Just dread this, and club players generally. So this is definitely a solid opening and the number one choice. But you can see it violates many people's definitions of solid, that the king hasn't even been castled, there's double pawns. What makes it solid? The bishop pair. It's difficult to exploit these weaknesses, and in a way you could argue this pawn, this is another little trick about this, is kind of a shelter for black's position. You're not being blasted to bits because white can't really get at you that easily. So it's kind of solid in different ways. You're going to be difficult to beat. This is maybe a characterization of a Terminator with the black pieces, this position. It's just a shame. So many people, if you try and play this online, so many people will vary before you even get to this position. So yeah, you could argue this is solid. And if you do want to play another version of the Ruy Lopez, let's have a look at a different choice, a favourite of both Magnus Carlsen and Kramnik, for our second choice in the Ruy Lopez, but not the Berlin. So let's go back. So e4. Okay, so e4, e5, knight f3. So classic Ruy Lopez. But here, instead of knight f6, you play a6. And there's a long line here after bishop a4, knight f6, white castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3. It's all natural stuff, well trodden. Black castles. Okay. Now we have h3, for example, bishop b7, and it looks as though white's locking out that bishop with d3, d6, a3, and a key move, knight b8. So this is kind of Breyer move. This move, rerouting the knight, is very, very important, part of the concepts of this system. And black generally gets a pretty solid game. An example, Magnus Carlsen game, if you want to look up, Zagalko, who is one of the champions at an online site at the moment, he was white against Magnus Carlsen, Rapid 2015, and Carlsen won with the black pieces in 44 moves. It's a favourite of Magnus Carlsen and Kramnik anyway. It's a pretty solid position to start off with. Now, why is this solid for black? It's solid, you could argue, because black has a solid fortification of the centre, and black also has possibilities of playing aggressively later with eventual d5. So it is actually kind of symmetrical as well, you could argue. But really, I think the key thing about this is, the centre is pretty solid here. And the pieces are not too bad in cooperation with the pawns. So that's another solid choice. Okay, so this is in the Ruy Lopez. There's two main choices, I would say, if you want ultra solid. Now let's go back and let's see if we introduce some notions of other sort of trade-offs you could make to get a solid opening with the black pieces. And you might find this controversial because you're giving yourself real downsides, but these downsides might be longer term to exploit. So under the definition of not being so easy to beat very, very quickly, you could argue that after e4, e6, this was a favourite of Mikhail Botvinnik, the French defence. You can argue, well, this bishop is a bad bishop. If you want to look at a lot of French defence videos, by the way, Kingscrusher TV / French defence, and for Ruy Lopez, Kingscrusher TV / Ruy Lopez. So anyway, the French defence after d4, d5, for beginners it's good. You're not going to be mated so easily, so quickly on f7. So you could argue, well, it's a kind of solid choice for the beginner player getting fed up of the f7 soft spot. But in the various methods against the French defence, it can be quite solid in terms of pawn structure and king safety. For example, if white plays the Tarrasch, this is one of the very popular choices after Sigebert Tarrasch, c5, e takes, you could inconvenience your queen a little bit with queen takes d5, maintaining a solid pawn structure here. So this is pretty solid. So after taking, yes, you accept a tempo gain. This is the trade-off. And if we look at this position, this is actually, can be very, very pleasant for black potentially. Black, as well as a solid pawn structure, can do something about this bishop later quite often with a6 and b5 and put the bishop on this diagonal. It's a very, very solid position in this example of the French defence. If we go back, there's other treatments to the French. Let's look at the Winoa variation. So e4, e6, d4, d5, and now knight c3, allowing this seemingly dreaded pin. Now an ultra solid, what I thought was an ultra solid variation, especially for online chess if you want to last a few moves, is to acknowledge that white might have a plan of bishop a3 later, one of Fischer's favourite plans in the Winoa, Bobby Fischer. But you could actually do this kind of lockdown approach here, quite radical, queen a5 and queen a4, and it's a kind of lockdown, and it's not a guarantee you're going to lose. You've made trade-offs. Potentially your dart squares are are weak, your bishop's bad in an endgame. You could lose a horrible grueling long endgame. But as I say, under certain definitions of solidity, you might just consider lasting a long time to be a nice feature of the opening, especially if it's like online blitz and you're very fast moving. You just don't want to be losing very, very quickly. So this could be an interesting start position to consider in the Winoa of the French defence. So you could say this is kind of solid. So how else can you make trade-offs? The trade-offs here, philosophically, yes, you're giving yourself bad, bishop quite often in the French. Lack of space, that's another trade-off concession. Does that make the opening not so solid? See, it really depends on your broader definition. If your broader definition is the ability not to lose too quickly or too easily, then it fulfills that. It can be a long-term strategy. Tigran Petrosian used the French defence and he hated losing. It was one of his great weapons of choice, and he had many, many draws with the French defence. So you could argue it is a super solid opening. Modern grandmasters, they tend to avoid the French defence and use more the Ruy Lopez. Is massively popular still, especially the Berlin variation. So the Ruy Lopez is much more popular at super grandmaster level at the moment, but the French defence used to be, used by many champions, Botvinnik, Petrosian, etc. So you could argue very, very solid opening. It has certain concessions, certain downsides, but that's the price you would pay for the solidity. And in terms of that price, let's look at one of the favourites of Anatoly Karpov. You could argue a very, very solid, difficult to beat player. So let's look at the Caro-Kann defence here. So e4, c6. So what price is paid for solidity? I mean, the Caro-Kann was used by Karpov quite successfully to neutralise, again, the likes of Garry Kasparov. Like Kramnik used the Berlin Wall, Karpov used the Caro-Kann against Kasparov to kind of neutralise the ferocity of Kasparov's 1e4. So an example variation, very, very topical, very trendy, is knight d2, black takes, black plays this bishop out, so it sorts out the issue of the French defence, the bad bishop. And what you get instead is a concession in terms of space is quite evident. For example, here, you have to consider that your pieces are just occupying the first 3 rows only, and white has that extra space, and you might play like this, and it's a solid position here, you could argue. For example, white castling queenside. The strategic break d5 is not so easy to achieve here, because that could backfire on white's king, c4 and d5, to try and break up the pawn structure into liquid, less solid pawn structure. You could argue here this is interesting for black. So say king b1, black could even dare to castle kingside, and there's work to do to prove that white has an advantage. Okay, so the concessions here generally in the Caro-Kann, and often in fact black castles queenside in the Caro-Kann when opportunity permits as well. So there's a Kasparov book on the Caro-Kann. He's recommended quite often black castling queenside sometimes. So the Caro-Kann, the concession made is less space. You're basically trading off space, but what you're not having a particularly bad piece like the c8 bishop for a long-term exploitation of weakness. So it's kind of solid, I suppose, in the longer term if you can survive the middle game. So it's an example of a solid opening choice. You just got to be aware of the trade-offs you're making, and if you're comfortable, if your style of play it matches the opening, that you're comfortable with those trade-offs and concessions you're making to get that kind of solidity. It is generally regarded, in terms of our broader definition of difficult to beat, Karpov playing the Caro-Kann, very difficult to beat. It's a solid opening. So that's why it's a choice here in this list. Let's look at another kind of more outrageous concession for solidity, which you might not consider a solid opening, but I certainly do. Basically, after e4, you could also consider the Scandinavian defense. It used to be called the center counter, because you're countering in the center quite aggressively, attacking that pawn. After e takes, queen takes, knight c3, there's the 3 main moves: queen a5, queen d8, or the trendy queen d6. And you might consider, well, why on earth would you consider, for example, this position solid? Well, playing with the white pieces, I had this game once against Andrew Ledger, an international master, and basically if we look at this sequence and see what's happened, it's difficult for white to have a strategic pawn break, because this knight blocks in the pawn here. Black has basically tricked quite often the player with the white pieces to get a solid version of the Caro-Kann defense, which we've just mentioned is pretty solid and doesn't have that bad bishop. So it's a kind of Caro-Kann trick at minimum. And in terms of strategic breaks, making your solid, in inverted commas, pawn structure more liquefied, without this easy c4 d5, this is, although you've lost tempo as the trade-off, the concession you're making for the solidity, it is difficult to break down this kind of position quite often. And also, Vladimir Kramnik has been playing around with that trendy looking move, by the way, queen d6. So you can look at various examples of Vladimir Kramnik playing this opening even. There's one against Vishy Anand in the Zurich Champions Rapid 2009, where Kramnik played queen d6, and the game went knight f3, knight f6, d4, and Kramnik actually played g6 here. And so it has got some advantages that white hasn't got an easy strategic pawn break to mash the pawn structure. So you could argue, well, there's an element of solidity in this kind of position as well, even with black fianchettoing the bishop, creating some theoretical weaknesses there. It's the lack of pawn break which kind of makes the position quite comfortable here as well. So you could argue the Scandinavian, even with the vogue, especially with the vogue queen d6, has some elements of solidity that we could explore. So the concessions here philosophically, tempo gaining from white might be excited to gain those tempos on the queen, but it gives that solidity to the black position quite often. So that's another very interesting opening with the idea of creating solidity. Another one which I often use. And I realise now, although it's not generally regarded as a solid opening, another thing that often makes an opening solid is how much you know about it, how comfortable you are with it, and sort of provoking weaknesses from the opponent. The opponent's pawns can often increase the solidity of your own position if they're overly provoked. And I like the Tango. For me, I found this personally solid, but I played this quite a bit and know some of the tricks. And my good friend Paul Georgiou, introduced me to it. But white is basically occupying the centre, and you haven't really got a bad piece in this particular variation. This is quite comfortable for black. If you put this from an engine perspective and evaluate this position, black really has no issues here. Quite a solid pawn structure, good harmony between the pieces and pawns. You could argue, this is particularly solid, an example. But there are other downsides of the Tango. There are critical tests that white could make early and not get this kind of position, which gives black this solidity. So this is a more dreamy kind of ideal that you would get from the opening. So that's one problem. In actually getting to this kind of ideal Tango position, there are all sorts of other pitfalls. But if you're willing to take that risk, then you can actually achieve solid positions through, some provocation or rare book tricks that you particularly might, specialize in. You might have more knowledge than most opponents. So you kind of do get that notion of solidity, because you become more difficult to beat quickly and easily if you really know more about these pet lines that you might have than the opponent. So for me, it's the Tango as an example there, and it represents that knowledge difference, creating that solidity in terms of being more difficult to beat then. Now here, let's go on to another example of creating solidity from the opening. E4, B6, so inviting an occupation in the centre. This is a hyper-modern trick, B6. This has got a bad reputation, this opening, but it could result in a position, after bishop b7, knight c3, e6, which kind of resembles almost a French defence variation. If you look at this pawn structure here, you could regard as quite solid, and you might even be willing to trade off your dark squared bishop to put more pressure on e4. So bishop b4, bishop d3, knight f6. It's another idea for solidity, and it might confuse a lot of opponents, taking them out of book. So you're inviting the opponent to occupy the centre and potentially get a nice French defence style position. You can also, let's have a look at another philosophy for getting solidity by the idea of counterattack, the fear of tons of theory, believe it or not. I think you could argue that after e4, c5 could be a solid approach to the opening, especially in the UK. Most players just avoid mainline Sicilian variations like the plague. They end up playing more positional openings, which are going to make you potentially more difficult to beat easily and quickly because they fear your theoretical knowledge. Now, the Rolls Royce of the Sicilian openings to aim for is the Najdorf. So this position, knight f6, you could argue this is one of the more solid variations of the Sicilian, tried and tested, the greatest exponents Fischer and Kasparov behind them. So they've basically, used this idea that if they know this opening really, really well, they're going to get their solidity by counterattack, by dynamic play, by their vast knowledge of the opening, especially compared to the opponents. They're going to work really hard to prepare themselves in all the critical variations, and opponents will be so scared that you won't even get this position generally. You'll get all these anti-Sicilians thrown at you, which you need to know how to handle. So we've had quite a few anti-Sicilian videos actually on the Kingscrusher channel if you want to check them out in the last few months. So you'll never really get this position in practice. So there's a solidity by sort of aiming for something as if you really know your stuff. It's theoretically got great exponents behind it, like Kasparov and Fischer. So you could argue, well, this is a solid opening for what it represents and the fear it could give to your opponents, actually knowing the theory of the Sicilian Najdorf. even though you might not consider it a solid opening at all. If you really know all the anti-Sicilian lines, you'll end up getting, most of the time, really solid positions, in fact. Okay, so let's go back. Another way of achieving solidity, in my view, is by hypermodernism, inviting the occupation in the centre. So after e4, g6, the modern defences we've been looking at recently. So d4, bishop g7, you let white occupy the centre, and it makes your position more difficult to crack quite often. And in fact, there's an ultra provocative a6 move here. Ruy Lopez recommending this a6, and you're going to be you'll be using a double fianchetto, you'll be hitting white centre, and you could argue you're creating a solidity by inviting the opponent to occupy the centre and aiming to counterattack with b5, bishop b7, knight b7, c5 later. It can create very, very interesting games, and to increase your solidity in this, you really just need to know all the stem games, generally the key stem games, the ideas, and to be good tactically, especially to try and take those opportunities to take out the opponent's centre, sometimes even sacrificing if necessary to make sure the opponent hasn't got a lethal attack which is going to blow your king wide open. So you really need to know your stuff to make this a solid opening. But hypermodernism generally, the trade-off you're making is that invitation to occupy the centre, and you're creating that kind of solidity in terms of being more difficult to beat easily and quickly. Basically, under that criteria, you could argue that this is a solid opening. And the last kind of main style of creating solidity, I would say, against the great Anatoly Karpov, Tony Miles ventured a6. So this is solidity by outrageousness, maybe winding the opponent up, being a troll, getting a certain version of the French defence actually in particular. Because what happened here after d4, b5, as in Karpov Miles 1980, b5, knight f3, bishop b7. After knight f6, queen e2, e6, a4, c5. The bishops are not too bad. D takes. The bishops are not bad at all. And Karpov really, maybe had a technical advantage here, but after e5, knight d5, black has that d5 square. And you could argue, well, black has got a reasonably solid position, and Tony Miles went on to win from this position against, Anatoly Karpov. So what really happened there? Well, again, if the opponent hasn't got too much preparation in the particular opening you're choosing, and you might have wound them up as well, maybe that creates solidity, an element of solidity. You become a little bit more difficult to beat easily and quickly, because you've disturbed your opponent, you've trolled them a bit in the opening. So maybe this is another kind of fundamental way to create this notion of solidity. So I hope you've got something different from this video, that I haven't represented the notion of solidity in a fixed format like a nice pawn structure. You might want to have double pawns like the Berlin Wall. You might compromise your pawn structure. You might inconvenience your king. You might let the opponent occupy the centre. You might troll the opponent like this, throw hypermodernism at them. You might just have these pet lines you just know intensely more than the opponent. You might terrify the opponent that you know the opponent the opening, so theoretically like Najdorf that you terrify them into playing anti-Sicilian variations. So there are a number of different approaches you could argue that create solidity. The classic ones, of course, you kind of symmetrically occupy the centre, like in the Ruy Lopez. The classical approach to the game is not the hypermodern. You occupy, you have a kind of like arm wrestling contest in the centre, to occupy the centre, to keep hold of strong strategic points in the centre. That's a kind of classical view of solidity. But as I say, I think you could argue under a broader notion of solidity, just basically a lot of us just don't want to be beaten up on the chessboard quickly or easily or both. And to do that, yeah, there are these other kind of methods, which I hope you might at least argue with me in the comments. This is a pretty controversial video, what I've recommended here for gaining that notion of solidity. But it depends really, I believe, on how broad you think that notion is. So I hope you enjoyed this. comments and questions on YouTube. And if you want to challenge me on Chess World, by the way, bit.ly/chessworld, and I'll be able to invite you for a game. Okay, thanks very much.